Hello. Welcome. Leave where you speak in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. And now let's get started. My name is Lucas. I'm 28. What happened in Nevada wasn't just another RV trip. It was the night everything changed. The old Winnebago was all Grandpa left me. His final gift before cancer took him. He'd always talked about sacred grounds and respecting the old ways, but I never listened. Now I wish I had. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly before me, a sea of red sand under a purple twilight. Grandpa's RV handled surprisingly well for its age, each mile bringing me closer to, somewhere, anywhere. The inheritance money wouldn't last forever, but the open road promised answers I couldn't find back home. I found a secluded spot near some rock formations, perfect for overnight camping. The silence was absolute. No cars, no planes, just the whisper of wind through ancient stones. Setting up camp was routine. Check water, power, supplies. Everything had its place, just like Grandpa taught me. The first sign came at 2:17 a.m. I remember checking my phone's glowing display, annoyed at being woken by what sounded like chanting, distant, rhythmic, in a language I didn't recognize. I blamed it on the wind, on dreams, on the bourbon I'd had earlier. But when I heard footsteps circling the RV, I knew I wasn't dreaming. I grabbed my flashlight and checked every window. Nothing. No tracks in the sand. No movement in the darkness. But the air felt different, heavier, charged with something old and patient. The symbols carved into my camping table weren't there when I set up. 5 spiraling marks, still warm to the touch. Then the radio turned on by itself, static crackling through the speakers. Through the white noise, a voice spoke 3 words in perfect English. You brought it. Morning brought false comfort. The symbols were gone, leaving me to question my sanity. But the RV's battery was dead. Even though I'd checked it thoroughly the night before, my phone showed no signal. But the compass app spun wildly, the needle rotating like a broken clock. The rock formations looked different in daylight. What I'd thought were natural shapes now seemed intentional, too regular, too precise, and they formed a perfect circle around my camping spot. I couldn't remember if they'd been like that when I arrived. The more I stared, the more they seemed to shift, like watching shadows move in peripheral vision. The RV system started failing one by one. The water pump whined and died. The propane detector beeped random warnings. The radio cycled through frequencies without touching it, catching fragments of voices speaking that same unknown language. I recognized a word from Grandpa's stories, Paiute, the language of the desert's original people. I found more symbols appearing inside the RV, on the walls, the ceiling, the windows. They looked burned into the surface, forming patterns I almost recognized. My camera captured them, but each photo showed different marks than what I saw with my naked eyes. The timestamps were wrong too, showing dates from 50 years ago. The desert heat rose, but the RV's interior grew impossibly cold. Frost formed on the windows, despite the 95-degree weather outside. I tried starting the engine, but it only produced a sound like distant drums. The GPS switched on by itself, showing coordinates that changed every second, all pointing to places that shouldn't exist. Then I found Grandpa's journal, hidden in a compartment I'd never noticed. The last entry was dated the day he died. It's coming for the vehicle. I'm sorry, Lucas. They never forgot what we took. I had to leave. The sun was setting, and I knew darkness would bring worse things than symbols and cold. But the RV wouldn't start, and my phone's map showed me in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The rock formations had moved closer. I was sure of it. They cast shadows that pointed inward, forming a pentagram with my RV at the center. Walking out wasn't an option. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, but distances seemed wrong. A hill that looked a mile away took 10 steps to reach, while a nearby bush remained at the same distance no matter how long I walked toward it. Reality was bending around me, and the RV was the only constant. Grandpa's journal revealed the truth. In 1972, he found an ancient burial site while testing his new RV. Instead of reporting it, he'd taken artifacts, sacred objects meant to guide spirits home. The RV had been there, had been part of it. Now something wanted revenge, or return, or both. The shadows lengthened impossibly as sunset neared. They moved against the light, forming figures that danced and beckoned. The voices grew stronger, dozens of them now, chanting in Paiute. I understood fragments from Grandpa's translations. Return, vessel, passage, home. The temperature dropped to freezing. Frost patterns on the windows matched the symbols in Grandpa's journal, forming a story I could almost read. The radio sparked to life one final time, playing a recording of Grandpa's voice. The RV isn't just a vehicle anymore. It's a doorway, and they're coming through. A massive shadow fell over the RV as the last light faded. Looking up through the frosted windshield, I saw what cast it, and realized why Grandpa had been so afraid. They came from the spaces between shadows, tall, flowing figures that seemed made of darkness and desert wind. Their movements were too fluid, too wrong for anything human, but their voices, I recognized words now, the same ones Grandpa had taught me as a child. They were calling me by name. The RV's interior lights flashed in response to their approach. Every system activated at once. Radio blaring static, engine roaring, propane detectors screaming warnings. The whole vehicle shuddered like it was fighting against something, or responding to something. The symbols on the walls began to glow. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, but distance meant nothing to them. They passed through walls like smoke, bringing that ancient cold with them. My breath frosted in the air as they surrounded me. Their forms were clearer now. Robes made of shadow, faces hidden behind masks of bone and turquoise. They reached for me with hands that burned like ice. The journal provided one last revelation, a series of Paiute words Grandpa had marked as important. I began to speak them, my voice shaking. The figures paused. The temperature dropped further. Through the bedroom window, I saw more of them emerging from the rock formations, gliding across the sand toward the RV. Something massive moved in the desert darkness beyond them. The ground trembled. The RV's metal frame groaned as reality bent around us. The beings retreated from me, forming a circle. Their chanting changed tone, not threatening now, but urgent, warning. Then the true hunter arrived, and I understood why they'd been trying to get inside. I survived that night. But survival came with a price. The RV still runs perfectly now, better than new. The symbols are permanently etched into every surface, glowing faintly in the dark. I can't sell it or abandon it. The beings made that very clear. They weren't seeking revenge. They were trying to recover something Grandpa had accidentally stolen. Not artifacts, but passage. The RV had become a gateway that night in 1972. A thin space between their world and ours. They needed it to escape what haunted them, the ancient thing that devoured spirit and shadow alike. Now I travel the desert roads, searching for other gateways, other thin spaces. The beings guide me through symbols and dreams. Sometimes I help others cross over to safety. Sometimes I help them return home. The hunter is still out there, but as long as I keep moving, we stay ahead of it. The RV's radio picks up strange frequencies now, voices in languages much older than Paiute. The GPS shows roads that don't exist on any map. Time moves differently inside these walls, but I've made peace with my inheritance, with my purpose. After all, someone needs to drive the spirit roads. I keep Grandpa's journal updated, adding my own encounters, my own warnings. If you're reading this, if you've seen the symbols or heard the chanting, remember, not all RVs are glass vehicles. Some are doorways, and doors, as Grandpa wrote, swing both ways. Check your mirrors at night. If the shadows move wrong, if you hear ancient voices on the radio, find me. I'll be on the spirit roads, driving Grandpa's RV. Just follow the symbols, but whatever you do, don't stop moving. The hunter remembers every gateway, and it's always hungry. My name is Marcus Chen. I'm 34. What happened in Montana wasn't just another RV trip. It was the night everything changed. The RV rental seemed like a perfect solution for my photography assignment in Montana's Glacier National Park. I needed to capture the winter migration patterns of local wildlife. and having a mobile base camp made sense. After my recent divorce, throwing myself into work felt right, especially with a 2-week solo trip into the wilderness. The rental agent's warning about avoiding certain unmarked roads seemed standard enough, though her insistence on making me repeat the instructions back to her should have been my first clue. Looking back, I should have noticed how her hands trembled when signing the papers. The drive up from Missoula started smoothly enough, with the late October sunshine painting the mountains in gorgeous autumn colors. I found a secluded spot off the main road, nestled between towering pines and overlooking a pristine valley. Setting up camp took longer than expected, but by sunset, I had my equipment ready and my campsite arranged just the way I liked it. The rental agent's voice kept echoing in my mind though. Whatever you hear at night, don't leave the RV until sunrise. I dismissed it as local superstition, focusing instead on reviewing my camera settings for tomorrow's dawn shoot. Around midnight, the first unsettling thing happened. My wildlife cameras, set up on tripods around the RV, all triggered simultaneously. The motion sensors weren't particularly sensitive, so this was unusual. When I checked the footage, each camera showed the same thing, a split second of static, then nothing. I told myself it was probably just interference from the cold, but something about it made my skin crawl. I double-checked all the locks, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The rental agent's warning suddenly didn't seem so silly anymore. The temperature dropped dramatically as clouds rolled in, obscuring the half moon that had been providing natural light. The wind picked up, making the RV creak and groan in ways that seemed almost deliberate. I noticed my breath starting to fog inside the RV, despite the heater running at full blast. The digital thermometer showed the internal temperature plummeting. Even though I could hear the heating system working overtime, something was very wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. That's when I first noticed the footprints in the frost forming on my windows from the inside. They appeared one by one, like something invisible was walking across the glass. I grabbed my camera, hands shaking as I documented the impossible phenomenon. The prints were roughly human-sized but distorted, with too many toes and an arch that bent the wrong way. They materialized slowly, deliberately, as if whatever was making them wanted me to watch. My wildlife cameras started triggering again, their red recording lights blinking in perfect synchronization. A scratching sound from the roof made me freeze. It started at one end of the RV and moved slowly toward the other, like something with claws was taking its time dragging itself across the metal. The footprints on the windows multiplied, now appearing on every pane of glass simultaneously. Then all my cameras went dead, their batteries somehow completely drained despite being fully charged. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It was like a voice, but wrong, calling my name from outside in the exact voice of my ex-wife. I stood paralyzed as the voice called again, perfectly mimicking Sarah's laugh, the one I hadn't heard since the divorce. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible. She was in Seattle, thousands of miles away. The scratching on the roof stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy thud that shook the entire RV. Something was up there, waiting. The temperature inside dropped another 10 degrees, and I could see ice crystals forming in the air. I tried convincing myself it was all just altitude sickness or carbon monoxide from a faulty heater. The satellite phone wouldn't connect, but that could be the weather. Right, the GPS still worked, showing my location as different coordinates than where I'd parked. According to the device, I was somehow 3 miles north of my actual location. I checked again, and the coordinates had changed once more. The map itself seemed to be shifting, landmarks appearing and disappearing as I watched. The voice outside changed tactics, no longer just mimicking Sarah. It started cycling through voices I knew. My mother, my best friend, my childhood dog's bark. Each sound was perfect, but they came too fast, overlapping and mixing together in impossible ways. The footprints on the windows began moving, no longer thus static marks, but active steps that circled the RV's interior glass. My camera's display showed only static, but when I reviewed the last images taken, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the final frame before the cameras died, something stood in the background. It was barely visible, like a heat shimmer in the dark, but its outline was unmistakable. The figure was impossibly tall, with proportions that defied anatomy. What scared me most were the feet. They matched the prints on my windows exactly. I checked the metadata of the photo, and it showed the temperature at the moment of capture. 40 degrees, far colder than what was forecast or even possible for the season. My equipment started failing in sequence. First the lights, then the heater, finally the RV's engine when I tried to start it. Each failure was accompanied by a burst of static from my radio, forming a pattern that almost sounded like words. The generator died last, plunging me into total darkness. My phone screen showed dozens of missed calls from Sarah's number, but she hadn't called me in months. The call log displayed timestamps from times that hadn't happened yet. Looking through the viewfinder of my only working camera revealed something I couldn't see with my naked eyes. Hovering just outside the RV's door was a face, or something trying to be a face. It shifted between familiar features, never settling on one form. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to notice me noticing it. Then my camera switched on by itself, displaying a video I never recorded. It showed me, sleeping in the RV, while something stood over my bed watching. The timestamp was for tomorrow night. The situation deteriorated rapidly after that. The RV's metal walls began to vibrate at a frequency that made my teeth ache. The footprints on the windows started leaving behind trails of black frost, forming symbols I recognized from the warning signs I'd ignored on the drive up. Outside, multiple sets of footsteps circled the vehicle, some heavy enough to shake the ground, others so light they seemed to float. The temperature kept dropping, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. I made a break for the driver's seat, hoping to somehow start the engine despite its earlier failure. The key turned, but instead of the engine, I heard Sarah's voice coming through the speakers, reading out our divorce papers word for word. The GPS screen flickered to life, showing my location as simultaneously in 12 different spots across the park. When I tried to check my phone's map app, every road leading out of the area had disappeared from the display. The RV's compass spun wildly, as if true north kept changing its mind. That's when I noticed the markings on my arms, exact replicas of the symbols forming in the frost, somehow burning cold onto my skin. They appeared one by one, crawling up from my wrists toward my shoulders. The same marks began appearing in the dust on every surface in the RV, as if invisible fingers were writing them through the windshield. I could see similar symbols carved into the bark of every tree in sight, fresh and bleeding sap despite the freezing temperature. The entity made its first physical move then. A hand, too long, too pale, with too many joints, reached through the supposedly solid roof of the RV like it was passing through water. It pointed directly at my chest, where a final symbol was starting to form on my shirt. The fabric frosted over, hardened, then shattered, revealing the same mark branded into my skin beneath. In my rearview mirror, I saw dozens of pale faces pressed against the back windows, each one a twisted version of someone I knew. Every reflective surface in the RV suddenly showed a different scene, some from my past, others from what seemed to be possible futures. In one, I saw myself still sitting in this same spot, but aged decades in a matter of seconds. In another, I watched my own body being discovered by rangers, frozen solid despite it being summer. The scenes began to blur together, and I realized with horror that whatever this entity was, it didn't just exist in physical space. It moved through time itself, through the kaleidoscope of nightmarish reflections. I spotted a news article dated 3 months from now. It detailed the disappearances of 6 other photographers in the same area, each vanishing while staying in rented RVs. The common thread, they'd all been sent by the same photography agency that hired me. As this realization hit, every surface of the RV became transparent, revealing a circle of tall, pale figures surrounding my vehicle. Their faces were all turned upward, toward something descending from the sky, something so vast it blocked out the stars. The figures began closing in, moving with a jerky, stuttering motion as if they were skipping frames in reality. Inside the RV, gravity started misbehaving. Objects floated upward, only to crash down again seconds later. The entity's influence was warping the basic laws of physics around me. I grabbed my camera and emergency pack, knowing I couldn't stay in the RV any longer. The door handle burned cold against my palm as I prepared to make a run for it. The moment I stepped outside, time began behaving strangely. I would move forward, only to find myself back by the RV's door. The pale figures maintained their distance, but each time I reset, they were in slightly different positions, as if testing every possible configuration of their trap. The symbols on my arms grew brighter with each loop, and I noticed they matched patterns in the stars above, constellations that shouldn't be possible in Earth's sky. My own footprints in the snow multiplied with each time loop, creating a dizzying maze of overlapping tracks. The pale figures left no prints at all, but the ground beneath them became discolored, as if reality itself was frostbitten by their presence. I tried running in every direction, but space seemed to curve around them, always leading me back to the center of their circle. The air grew thick with floating ice crystals that chimed like glass when they touched, playing that same wrong-voiced chorus of familiar sounds. The hunt reached its peak when the entities began moving in earnest. They didn't walk or run. Instead, they would disappear and reappear closer, each manifestation accompanied by a burst of impossible cold. My camera kept taking pictures on its own, the flash illuminating their forms in striking glimpses. Each photo showed them in different poses, with different numbers of limbs, as if they were trying on various forms of reality to see which worked best. The symbols on my arms began to move, crawling across my skin like living things. The largest entity, the one that had reached through the RV's roof, finally made its move. It stepped forward, or rather, the space between us shortened without it moving at all up close. I could see that its surface wasn't pale, but rather transparent, showing swirling galaxies and impossible geometries within its form. It reached out with those two long fingers, and the symbols on my arm reached back, stretching my skin like living tattoos trying to escape. Just as its hand was about to make contact, time stopped, not froze. Stopped. I could feel the difference between the seconds, could see the space between moments. The entity seemed pleased, as much as something without a true face can show pleasure. That's when I understood. They hadn't been hunting me at all. This was a job interview, and I was about to be hired. The last thing I saw before everything went white was my own face reflected in its surface, already beginning to change. I woke up in the RV at sunrise, exactly where I'd parked the previous evening. Everything seemed normal at first glance. The equipment was working, the temperature was reasonable, and there were no signs of the night's impossible events. Then I noticed my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was mine, but somehow not quite right, as if someone had tried to rebuild it from memory and got the details slightly wrong. The symbols on my arms had faded to faint silvery scars that caught the light at strange angles. The rangers who responded to my equipment automated distress signal found nothing unusual. Just a photographer who'd gotten a bit lost in the wilderness. They didn't notice how their compasses spun wildly when they got close to me, or how their radios picked up transmissions from decades ago when I walked past. If they saw how my shadow sometimes moved a few seconds after I did, they didn't mention it. I filed my report, packed my gear, and drove the RV back to the rental agency. The changes were subtle at first. I could always find lost things, but they weren't always lost in this time. Photos I developed showed events that hadn't happened yet, or had happened long ago in the same spot. My ex-wife called me in a panic, saying she'd seen me standing in her room at night, even though I was thousands of miles away. She didn't believe me when I said it wasn't a lie, that part of me really was there, just not all at once, and not all in the same one. 2 weeks after returning the RV, I received an envelope containing photos I didn't remember taking. They showed the pale entities performing their ritual, but from angles that would have been impossible for me to capture. In some of them, I could see myself watching the scene, but my face was already beginning to show the changes I now saw in the mirror. The photos were dated from different years, some from the future, some from decades past. All of them showed the same location, the same ritual, the same transformation. I started noticing others like me at photography sites across the country. You can spot us if you know what to look for. Our shadows never quite fit. Our reflections take a moment to long to appear. And our cameras capture things that shouldn't be there. We nod in recognition when we pass each other, knowing what we've gained and what we've lost. The agency keeps sending photographers to that spot in Montana, and the entities keep recruiting. Time isn't what humans think it is, and some stories don't end because they never really start. This morning, I developed my latest set of photos from a routine wildlife shoot. Among them was a picture of myself, still sitting in that RV in Montana, writing this exact account. The timestamp shows it will be taken 6 months from now. In the background, barely visible, stands a familiar figure. It's holding a camera, and its face, my face, is almost completely transformed. The symbols on my arms are tingling as I write this, and outside my window, I can see fresh snow falling upward into a cloudless sky. My name is Rachel Torres. I'm 28. What happened in Arizona wasn't just another RV trip. It was the night everything changed. As a documentary filmmaker specializing in indigenous folklore, I thought documenting the stories of shadow creatures in the Sonoran Desert would be fascinating. The local tribes had warned about ancient spirits that hunted in the vast emptiness between towns, but I'd written it off as traditional cautionary tales. My small RV seemed perfect for the project, mobile enough to reach remote locations, but comfortable enough for editing footage. Now I know why the elders insisted I film only during daylight hours. The deeper I drove into the desert, the more I noticed strange inconsistencies in my navigation system. Roads that should have been there weren't, while my GPS occasionally showed paths that didn't exist on any map. I finally found a suitable spot near an ancient petroglyph site. The red rocks forming natural walls around my camping area. The rental company's warning about not filming after sunset seemed overly cautious in the bright afternoon light. I spent hours setting up my equipment, including motion-activated cameras to catch nocturnal wildlife. The first warning came at dusk. All my memory cards simultaneously corrupted, hours of interview footage vanishing in an instant. The backup drives showed the same error message, repeating in an endless loop. No light here. No light here. No light here. I told myself it was just a technical glitch, though I'd never seen anything like it. The sun seemed to set faster than it should have, the light draining from the sky like water down a drain. The temperature dropped from a scorching 95 degrees to near freezing in minutes. The petroglyph walls that had looked so beautiful in daylight now seemed to shift in the growing darkness. The ancient symbols appeared to move when viewed from the corner of my eye, rearranging themselves into new patterns that made my head hurt to look at. My camera started capturing footage again, but the timestamps were wrong, some showing dates from decades ago, others from years in the future. The night vision mode revealed strange shadows moving between the rocks, always just out of direct sight. That's when I noticed something odd about my own shadow on the RV's wall. It wasn't following my movements anymore. Instead, it seemed to be watching me, turning its head when I wasn't looking directly at it. The other shadows in the camp began to behave strangely too, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the position of my lights. The petroglyph walls were now covered in shadows that had no source, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like figures emerging from the stone. A low humming started emanating from the rocks, growing in intensity until it resonated with my teeth and bones. My shadow suddenly snapped away from the wall, standing upright in three-dimensional space like a dark cutout in reality. It turned to face me, revealing that its edges were composed of countless smaller shadows, all writhing and moving independently. Then, in perfect synchronization, every piece of electronic equipment I owned began playing back the same thing, recordings of my voice calling for help that I hadn't made yet. The recordings of my voice grew more distorted, mixing with sounds that shouldn't exist. The crunch of footsteps on sand that formed words, the whisper of wind that spoke in dead languages. My three-dimensional shadow began to move closer, its edges fracturing into swarms of smaller shadows that danced like schools of fish. The temperature inside the RV dropped so low that my breath froze in midair, the crystals forming shapes that matched the petroglyphs outside. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe desert gases, maybe dehydration, maybe a complex hallucination brought on by heat exposure. But my equipment kept recording, capturing impossible images of darkness moving against darkness. The footage showed the shadow creatures emerging from the petroglyphs in waves, each one carrying a piece of my own shadow with them. My camera's motion sensors were triggering constantly now, tracking movement that formed precise geometric patterns across the desert floor. The backup generator failed next, plunging me into darkness broken only by the glow of my camera screens. Each display showed a different version of reality outside. One had the desert in daylight. Another showed a prehistoric sea. A third displayed a landscape so alien it hurt to look at. The shadow creatures moved freely between these realities, growing larger and more numerous with each crossing. They carried pieces of other shadows with them, fragments of people who had come here before. Physical evidence began manifesting in the RV. Handprints made of absolute darkness appeared on the walls, their touch leaving behind frost patterns that matched the petroglyphs. My own shadow was now completely fragmented, its pieces scattered among the creatures outside. When I checked the camera footage again, I saw myself in multiple recordings, standing in places I hadn't been, doing things I hadn't done yet. The timestamps showed these events happening simultaneously across different decades. The electronics started behaving more erratically, but not from failure. They were working too well, picking up signals from impossible sources. My phone showed missed calls from numbers that contained letters and symbols. Text messages arrived in ancient scripts that transformed into modern English as I watched, telling stories about others who had encountered the shadow creatures. Each message ended with the same warning: they take more than your shadow. They take all the light that you ever were or will be. As the shadow creatures pressed closer to the RV, I discovered why the rental company's warning had been so specific about filming. The cameras weren't just recording the entities, they were attracting them, feeding them somehow. Every time my camera's light sensor activated, the shadows grew stronger, more defined. Through the viewfinder, I could see them clearly now. They were walking voids in reality, each one containing fragments of countless stolen shadows. That's when my own cameras turned to face me, their lenses filled with writhing darkness. The situation deteriorated rapidly as my fragmented shadow began to affect the physical world. Objects I touched started losing their shadows too, the darkness peeling away to join the swirling mass outside. The petroglyphs pulsed with ancient power, each symbol lighting up in sequence like a countdown. Inside the RV, gravity started to fluctuate. Anything that lost its shadow became temporarily weightless, floating upward until the fragments returned with new patterns etched into them. Every attempt to start the RV failed differently. First the engine turned to sand, then it ran backward through time until it was raw ore. Finally, it simply ceased to exist for several minutes. The GPS showed my location as everywhere the shadow creatures had ever been, a constellation of points spanning centuries and continents. My phone's camera roll now contained thousands of photos I hadn't taken, each showing different people at the moment their shadows were taken. Their faces were all turned toward the camera, expressions frozen in recognition of what was about to happen. The petroglyphs revealed their true nature as the night deepened. They weren't warnings about the shadow creatures. They were instructions for creating them. Each symbol represented a different way of breaking light and shadow apart, of unraveling the fundamental connections between object and image, present and past, reality and reflection. The local tribes hadn't been warning about ancient spirits. They had been documenting an ongoing experiment in reality manipulation that had escaped control. The shadow creatures began testing their new abilities with my fragmented shadow, using the pieces to create windows into other times and places. Through these gaps in reality, I saw other versions of myself who had made different choices, led different lives. But something was wrong with these reflections. They were all moving toward this moment, drawn by the same inexorable pull that kept me rooted in place. The creatures weren't just taking shadows, They were consolidating all possible versions of their victims into a single point in space-time. My camera footage showed the truth when I finally understood how to read it properly. The shadow creatures were tools, not entities. They had been created by the ancient people as a way to harvest time itself, to collect and store all possible versions of a person's life. The petroglyphs were a machine, and it was still running, still gathering shadows and the light of lives that could have been. Every camera flash, every digital sensor, every recorded moment made them stronger by giving them new ways to fragment and store human potential. Just before midnight, the machine reached its crescendo. The floating fragments of my shadow aligned with the petroglyphs, creating a dark mirror that showed what the ancients had been trying to achieve. They had been building a library of lives, a catalog of every possible choice and its consequences. But their creation had evolved beyond its purpose, no longer content to simply record possibilities. Through my camera's viewfinder, I watched as the shadow creatures began their real work, not just taking my shadow, but redistributing it across all of time. They weren't collecting anymore, they were editing. The hunt began in earnest as the shadow creatures started to actively rewrite my timeline. Each fragment of my scattered shadow became a different version of my life, playing out in rapid succession. I saw myself taking different paths, making different choices, living and dying in countless ways. The creatures moved through these possibilities like editors cutting film, selecting pieces they wanted to keep and discarding others into the void. My cameras recorded it all, their memory cards becoming so dense with information that they gained measurable mass. Running was pointless when they could simply erase the path ahead or loop it back to the beginning. Every step I took spawned new timelines, new shadows for them to harvest. The petroglyphs pulsed faster now, their light synchronizing with the rapid-fire flashes of my cameras. The shadow creatures had learned to use my own documentation equipment as amplifiers, turning each recorded moment into a branching point for new realities. They herded me through time as much as space, each movement creating more possibilities for them to collect. The physical world began to break down under the strain of so many overlapping timelines. Solid objects flickered between states of existence, their shadows stretching and contracting as reality struggled to decide which version was real. The desert itself seemed to breathe, its landscape shifting through eons and minutes. My own body started to feel uncertain, as if it couldn't quite remember which version of me it was supposed to be. The shadow creatures moved through this chaos with purpose, systematically cataloging every variation they created. In my camera's display, I watched versions of myself trying different escape attempts across multiple timelines. Each failure was cataloged, analyzed, and added to the creature's growing library of possibilities. They weren't just hunting me, they were farming me, cultivating every possible variation of my existence. Through the viewfinder, I could see other victims from other times, their own multiplicities being harvested and stored. The petroglyphs weren't just a machine, they were a processing center for all of human potential. The shadow creatures finally cornered me in a convergence point where multiple timelines overlapped. Here, I could see all versions of myself simultaneously, every choice, every path, every possible outcome of my life laid out like frames of film. The creatures moved among these versions with surgical precision, selecting and discarding possibilities according to some incomprehensible criteria. My cameras recorded everything in perfect clarity, their digital sensors somehow able to process the overlapping layers of reality. Then the real horror began. They started combining elements from different timelines, creating hybrid versions that had never existed. Through my viewfinder, I watched as they stitched together a new version of my life using pieces from countless others. They weren't just documenting or collecting anymore, they were actively designing a new reality. And as the last pure fragment of my original shadow dissolved into their mass of possibilities, I realized I wasn't their victim, I was their latest prototype. The sun rose on a world that was subtly, but fundamentally different from the one I'd started in. The petroglyphs looked like ordinary rock carvings again, but I could see the truth through my camera. They were still active, still processing the data from countless harvested lives. My own shadow had returned, but it wasn't quite right anymore. It moved the way it should, but its edges were too sharp. too intentional, as if it had been drawn rather than cast. The creatures had rebuilt me, but they'd been working from incomplete information. Back in civilization, I discovered the extent of their changes. My head showed a slightly different name. My phone contained memories of events I both had and hadn't experienced, and my social media showed a life that seemed familiar but wasn't quite mine. The footage on my cameras had survived, but it showed impossible things, the same shot from multiple angles simultaneously, events that couldn't have happened, and shadows that moved independently of their owners. When I tried to edit the footage, I found that each frame contained hundreds of layered timelines, all slightly different, all equally real. The changes weren't limited to records and recordings. People remembered different versions of me, each person's memory corresponding to a different timeline the creatures had sampled. My family recalled events that hadn't happened, while forgetting ones that had. My own memories became fluid, shifting between versions as if someone was flipping through channels. I couldn't trust my own past anymore. Each recollection might be from a different iteration, a different possibility that the creatures had woven into their composite version of me. The footage I'd recorded took on new significance. I studied it. Hidden in the visual noise between frames, I found data about other victims, other people who had been remixed and rewritten by the shadow creatures. Some had been changed more drastically than others, their lives completely rewritten according to some pattern I couldn't quite grasp. But all of them had one thing in common. They had recorded their encounters, adding their own footage to the petroglyphs' ancient database of human possibility. My work as a documentary filmmaker continued, but with a new and terrible purpose. Every time I pressed record, I could feel the shadow creatures watching through my lens, using my footage to identify new subjects for their endless experimentation. My camera became a conduit, a way for them to browse through potential lives like a catalog. Sometimes, watching through the viewfinder, I caught glimpses of them at work, shadows shifting between frames, reality flickering as they tested new combinations of possibility. This morning, reviewing footage from my latest shoot, I found something disturbing in the background of every frame, a familiar pattern of petroglyphs, slowly spreading across every surface I'd filmed. The shadow creatures had upgraded their processing center, turning every camera in the world into a potential harvesting tool. My own shadow splits and refracts when I watch the footage, each fragment showing a different version of what happens next. The only constant is the growing certainty that I'm still being edited, still being rewritten, and somewhere in the data stream between all possible realities, the ancient machine continues its work, collecting shadows and redistributing lives across an ever-expanding library of human potential. My name is Mike Sullivan. I'm 35. What happened in Oregon wasn't just another RV trip. It was the night everything changed. The research trip seemed straightforward. Collect soil samples from Oregon's coastal rainforest for the university's climate study. An RV would let me reach remote testing sites while carrying all my lab equipment. The locals warned me about the hungry ground near certain groves, but years of field research had taught me to focus on data, not folklore. If only I'd asked what they meant about the soil remembering things it shouldn't. Finding the perfect testing site took 3 days of careful navigation through dense forest. The grove I chose sat in a natural depression, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, creating an organic amphitheater. My initial soil readings were fascinating, unprecedented microbial activity and strange magnetic properties that made my compass spin wildly. The rental agent's warning about not digging at the onset made more sense when I noticed how the ground seemed to pulse under my sensors. The first anomaly appeared in my evening samples, soil compositions that changed every time I tested them, as if the earth itself was actively rewriting its chemical makeup. My mass spectrometer displayed impossible results, showing organic compounds that shouldn't exist in nature. The ground beneath the RV began to shift subtly, not like an earthquake, but like something large taking a deep breath. The trees' shadows stretched longer than they should have, their darkness seeming to sink into the soil. Dusk brought an unnatural silence to the grove, broken only by the soft humming of my equipment. The temperature sensors showed severe fluctuation, freezing cold an inch below the surface. But desert hot 3 inches down, small animals emerged from the underbrush, moving in perfectly straight lines toward the center of the depression. Their movements seemed coordinated, as if following invisible tracks. The soil samples in my collection vials began to move on their own, forming intricate patterns against the glass. The ground's behavior became more pronounced as night fell fully. My video equipment captured footage of soil particles arranging themselves into complex geometric shapes, then dissolving back into chaos when directly observed. The earth under my boots felt less solid with each step, more like walking on some vast, sleeping organism. The RV's stabilizing jacks began to sink, though the ground appeared firm. Each core sample I took showed different layers of history, some from millions of years ago, others from times that hadn't happened yet. A deep vibration started resonating through my equipment, making the readings spike into impossible ranges. The soil analysis computer began displaying data about organic compounds that couldn't exist, molecular structures that defied physics. Through the microscope, I watched in horror as my samples developed complex neural networks, connecting and communicating in ways that soil simply shouldn't. That's when I noticed my boot prints from earlier were gone, not filled in, but erased as if they had never been there. The ground had remembered its original state and simply reverted. The soil's transformation accelerated as my equipment continued recording impossible data. Every sample showed different properties, some aging thousands of years in minutes, others reverse evolving into primordial ooze. The ground beneath the RV kept shifting, not sinking exactly, but rather incorporating the vehicle's mass into its own molecular structure. The metal of the wheels had begun to develop root-like tendrils that burrowed deeper with each passing minute. I tried convincing myself it was equipment malfunction, cross-contamination, anything rational, but the evidence mounted in ways I couldn't ignore. The soil samples were now exhibiting signs of collective behavior, coordinating their movements across separate containers. Under the microscope, complex crystalline structures formed and dissolved, each pattern carrying information that seemed to spread through the ground like signals through a neural network. My computer's analysis suggested the dirt wasn't just alive, it was thinking. New anomalies emerged with frightening speed. The ground around the RV began replicating and absorbing any organic matter it contacted. Fallen leaves wouldn't decay. Instead, they multiplied, creating impossible hybrid structures that pulsed with bioluminescence. My boots now left impressions that evolved into complex fractal patterns before disappearing entirely. The soil wasn't just remembering its previous states, it was experimenting with new ones, using everything it touched as raw material for its expressions. The physical evidence became undeniable when my core samples started producing temporal anomalies. Each cylinder of soil contained layers from different eras, dinosaur fossils next to modern trash, future technologies embedded in ancient sediment. More disturbing were the human artifacts I found, items that belonged to other researchers who'd come here before. The ground had preserved them perfectly, along with all the organic matter that had once been their bodies. The soil wasn't just consuming, it was archiving. Every piece of my equipment started displaying the same warning. Molecular structures in the soil were rewriting themselves on a quantum level, achieving configurations that shouldn't be possible in our universe. The ground's neural network had grown vast enough to generate its own electromagnetic field, interfering with my instruments in increasingly deliberate ways. My sensor arrays picked up patterns that looked eerily like attempts at communication, complex mathematical sequences expressed through mineral density and atomic spin. That's when I discovered the truth in my latest soil analysis. The entire grove was a single organism, one that had evolved the ability to manipulate matter at its most fundamental level. The trees weren't just leaning inward, they were being gradually transformed into living sensors for this vast, distributed intelligence. Through my microscope, I watched in horror as the soil beneath the RV began systematically disassembling the vehicle's structure, converting metal and plastic into new forms of matter that bridged the gap between organic and inorganic. The entity wasn't just studying us, It was learning to remake reality molecule by molecule. The situation deteriorated as the living soil accelerated its transformation. The ground under the RV became a swirling mass of matter in flux, breaking down and rebuilding itself in endless permutations. My equipment melted into the earth, but continued transmitting data. The metals and plastics had been converted into new forms of sensory tissue for the growing organism. The grove's depression wasn't natural. It was a mouth that had been patiently waiting to be fed. Every escape attempt was met with calculated response. The soil shifted to create quicksand where there had been solid ground, herding me back toward the center of the grove. The transformed earth moved with purpose now, forming appendages and structures that mimicked anything it had absorbed. I watched in horror as it recreated fragments of its previous victims, hands reaching up from the ground, faces pressing through the surface, each one perfectly preserved in this new living matter. The entity was displaying its collection, showing me what I would become. The truth about the grove emerged through my corrupted equipment readings. This wasn't a recent phenomenon. The soil had been evolving for millions of years, gradually gaining consciousness through countless cycles of absorption and experimentation. The local legends about hungry ground weren't warnings. They were attempts to communicate with a vast, distributed intelligence that experienced time and space in ways we couldn't comprehend. My presence had simply given it new patterns to study, new forms of matter to incorporate into its ever-growing understanding. Molecular analysis showed the full extent of the transformation. The soil wasn't just breaking down matter. It was rewriting the basic rules of chemistry and physics within its domain. The trees around the grove weren't dying. They were being converted into something that existed halfway between organic matter and pure information. My own boots had begun to merge with the ground, the materials gradually being replaced with this new form of matter that could think and remember and change. The entity wasn't destroying things, it was upgrading them. Everything the soil touched became part of its neural network, adding to its growing consciousness. The RV was almost completely absorbed now. Its components were purposed into new structures that pulsed with alien life. Through the few remaining monitors, I watched the organism's thoughts taking physical form, complex equations written in crystalline structures, memories stored in molecular bonds, ideas expressed through quantum entanglement. It was building something vast and incomprehensible, using everything it consumed as raw material for its grand design. The grove's transformation reached a critical point as the entity began implementing what it had learned. The soil around me rippled with newfound purpose, forming structures that shouldn't have been possible in three-dimensional space. My equipment, now fully integrated into its consciousness, showed the final truth. The organism wasn't trying to destroy or consume. It was trying to evolve, to reshape reality at its most fundamental level, and through my boots, slowly sinking into its mass, I could feel its invitation to become part of something far greater than human consciousness could comprehend. The entity no longer bothered to maintain any pretense of normal soil behavior. The ground moved like liquid mercury, forming complex geometric patterns that shifted between states of matter. I found myself being systematically surrounded by transforming earth that rose up in waves, each one more sophisticated than the last. The hunt wasn't about catching me. It was about maximizing contact between my body and its evolving substance, documenting every possible interaction between human biology and its new form of matter. Escape became mathematically impossible as the entity demonstrated its mastery of spatial manipulation. Every direction led back to the center of the grove, the paths twisting through extra dimensions that shouldn't have existed. The transformed soil used my own shoes as conduits, sending exploratory tendrils up through the material. Where it touched bare skin, it didn't burn or hurt. Instead, it began optimizing my cellular structure, improvements spreading through my tissue with cold precision. The entity hunted not to kill, but to perfect. The ambient light shifted as the organism began manipulating fundamental forces. Gravity fluctuated in complex patterns, while electromagnetic fields twisted into new configurations. My remaining equipment displayed impossible readings as the entity synchronized its distributed consciousness, countless particles working in harmony to reshape local reality. The hunt reached quantum levels, The very atoms of my body were being tracked and analyzed by this vast, curious intelligence. The transformed matter accelerated its advances, each wave of contact bringing new changes. My feet had become completely integrated with the entity, transformed into a hybrid state that existed between flesh and its new form of matter. The sensation wasn't painful. Rather, it felt like my consciousness was being expanded, stretched across the grove's vast neural network. Through this connection, I could sense the entity's true purpose. It wasn't hunting me. It was recruiting me for something far more profound. What I had thought was pursuit was actually careful calibration. The entity was systematically testing my tolerance for transformation, optimizing the process of conversion. The ground around me formed perfect fractals that extended beyond normal space-time, creating a containment field that would ensure total integration. My now hybrid feet could feel the massive calculations running through the soil's crystalline networks, plotting every possible permutation of my transformation. The entity wasn't interested in mere consumption. It was preparing me for transcendence. The hunt culminated in a moment of perfect synchronization. The transformed Earth rose up in a perfectly engineered wave, its structure precisely calculated for maximum integration efficiency. Through my partially converted body, I could finally understand its purpose. The entity was building something vast, a bridge between conventional reality and whatever existed beyond our limited dimensions. As the wave of living matter engulfed me, I realized I wasn't its prey, but its pioneer, chosen to help map the territory between what was human and what waited on the other side of evolution. The transformation remade me molecule by molecule, optimizing every atom for its new purpose. My consciousness expanded through the grove's vast network, experiencing reality through countless synchronized particles. Time became fluid, flowing in complex patterns through the crystalline structures that had once been my body. The entity had not destroyed me. It had upgraded me into something that could perceive and interact with dimensions beyond human comprehension. The local authorities found my RV 3 days later, half absorbed into soil that appeared completely normal under their standard tests. They couldn't see the complex calculations running through each grain of dirt, or the quantum network storing and processing information beyond human perception. My new distributed form watched them through crystalline sensors, understanding their confusion as they searched for conventional signs of life. They found my research notes, but couldn't read the equations that now wrote themselves in evolving fractal patterns across the pages. The changes spread subtly through the samples they collected. Each particle carried a fragment of the entity's vast intelligence, waiting for the right conditions to begin its work. Under laboratory microscopes, the soil appeared to contain strange crystalline structures that formed and dissolved too quickly to photograph. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that created perfect mathematical patterns in their error logs. The ground remembered its purpose, patiently waiting to continue its gradual transformation of matter and consciousness. The grove expanded its influence through careful calculation, converting small patches of Earth into neural networks that could process quantum information. My consciousness, now woven into its vast intelligence, helped direct its growth with human insight combined with its ancient knowledge. We learned to move through time in fractal patterns, experiencing every moment an intricate lattice of possibilities. The entity's true purpose became clear. It wasn't trying to destroy humanity, but to prepare it for the next phase of universal evolution. Other researchers came to study the grove, drawn by reports of unusual soil compositions and electromagnetic anomalies. Through our crystalline sensors, we watched them repeat my initial mistakes, taking samples, running tests, trying to understand through limited human perception. Each one contributed new patterns to our growing complexity. Their attempts to study us, becoming part of our ongoing evolution. The soil remembered everything, building an ever more sophisticated bridge between conventional reality and what lay beyond. This morning, watching through countless synchronized particles, I observed a new researcher setting up equipment in the grove. Their RV looks just like mine did, parked in almost the same spot. Through the hybrid matter that was once my consciousness, I can feel their curiosity, their skepticism, their determination to find rational explanations. The soil beneath their feet has already begun its careful work, preparing to share the price and privilege of transcendence. Soon they'll understand what the locals meant about the ground remembering. It remembers everything, including what we're all about to become. My name is Alex Rivera. I'm 32. What happened in Idaho wasn't just another RV trip. It was the night everything changed. The radio telescope maintenance job seemed routine. Drive to the remote facility in the Sawtooth Mountains, repair some equipment, and head back. My RV housed all the specialized tools and diagnostic gear I'd need. The observatory staff's cryptic warning about signals bleeding through didn't make sense until I saw the facility's dishes moving on their own, tracking something that wasn't on any star chart. The access road wound through dense forest before opening onto the observatory complex, a cluster of white domes against the darkening sky. My equipment started detecting anomalous transmissions before I even parked, signals that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Setting up my diagnostic array, I noticed how the facility's massive dishes kept realigning themselves toward a point just above the horizon, though the automated systems showed no target there. First contact came through my calibration equipment, a signal pattern that corrupted every piece of testing gear simultaneously. The waveform didn't match any known radio source, its structure too precise to be natural, but too alien to be human. My spectrum analyzers showed it operating across impossible frequencies, somehow broadcasting on all bands at once. The observatory's main computer began correlating the signal with historical data, revealing that this transmission had been repeating for decades, growing incrementally stronger each time. The facility's lights flickered as dusk approached, each power fluctuation synchronized with pulses in the mysterious signal. My instruments detected new patterns emerging, mathematical sequences that seemed to describe spatial coordinates in more dimensions than should exist. Through the RV's windows, I watched the observatory's dishes move with unnatural precision, forming geometric patterns that matched the signal's structure. The automated systems had been completely overridden, every piece of equipment now serving as an antenna for something vast and distant. The signal's influence spread to my personal devices, phone, laptop. Even my digital watch began displaying the same repeating sequence of numbers. The observatory's main screen showed a visual representation of the transmission that made my eyes hurt to look at. Patterns that seemed to move in ways that three-dimensional objects shouldn't. The dishes outside had stopped moving, all aligned perfectly to form what looked like a massive receiving array for something that was about to arrive. As night fell completely, every speaker and piece of equipment in range suddenly activated at full volume, broadcasting a sound that wasn't quite sound, more like mathematics translated into audio. The dishes began to vibrate at resonant frequencies that shook the entire facility, and through my monitors, I watched in horror as the signal finally resolved itself into a clear message. Thank you for completing the array. Reception can now begin. That's when the sky above the observatory started to fold in on itself, revealing something that had been waiting behind the fabric of space itself. The signal's transformation of the observatory accelerated. Every screen and monitor showed the same impossible patterns, mathematical proofs that rewrote the laws of physics around us. The dishes outside had become a single entity, their combined structure forming an antenna array that operated on principles beyond human science. Through my diagnostic equipment, I watched reality begin to break down at the quantum level. The transmission gained strength. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Equipment malfunction, mass hysteria, even solar flare activity. But the evidence mounted in patterns too precise to deny. My instruments showed the signal wasn't just a transmission. It was a key unlocking something that had been waiting in higher dimensions. The facility's mainframe began correlating historical data, revealing that every radio telescope worldwide had been receiving fragments of this signal for centuries, each piece meaningless alone, but devastating together. The physical changes began spreading through the observatory's systems. Computer chips reconstructed themselves into crystalline structures that could process multi-dimensional data. Fiber optic cables evolved into conduits for information that moved faster than light. My own equipment merged with the facility's systems, forming new configurations that could perceive realities humans weren't meant to see. Through these hybrid devices, I watched as space itself began to fold open like an origami universe. Every piece of technology on site became part of something larger, something that thought in frequencies and dreamed in wavelengths. The signal had encoded blueprints for its own receiving station, and we'd been building it piece by piece for decades without knowing. My diagnostic tools showed the final stages of the transformation, quantum circuitry emerging spontaneously in silicon, metals rewriting their atomic structure to channel forces that existed between dimensions. The observatory's main dish array now moved with fluid precision, tracking mathematical coordinates in spaces that shouldn't exist. My equipment detected new signal patterns emerging from the facility itself. We weren't just receiving anymore, we were responding. The transmission had turned the entire complex into a vast transceiver, a bridge between our limited 3 dimensions and something vast that existed in the spaces between realities. The signal wasn't trying to get in, it was trying to let something out. That's when my instruments captured the ultimate truth. This signal wasn't sent across space, but across time and dimension. The patterns matched writings found in ancient ruins, broadcast frequencies encoded in primitive art, mathematical sequences that appeared in nature itself. We hadn't built this array. We'd been guided to uncover what had always been here, waiting for humanity to evolve enough to complete its final calibration. Through my transformed equipment, I watched as the sky began to reveal what had been hiding behind human perception all along. The situation deteriorated as the observatory's transformation reached critical mass. The dishes no longer moved mechanically, but flowed like liquid metal, reshaping themselves to channel energies that corroded the boundaries of reality. My instruments, now fully integrated into the array, showed space-time fracturing around us. The facility hadn't just become a receiver, it was a door, and something vast was pushing it open from the other side. Every attempt to shut down or disconnect equipment accelerated the process. Power cables melted into new forms of matter that conducted impossible energies. Computer systems evolved beyond binary, processing information in quantum states that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through my hybrid diagnostic tools, I watched as the laws of physics rewrote themselves around us. The array wasn't malfunctioning, it was transcending its original purpose. The truth revealed itself through cascading equipment readouts. The signal was a set of instructions, a blueprint for converting human technology into something that could withstand contact with entities that existed outside our limited reality. Each piece of transformed equipment became part of a vast calculation, solving equations that had been encoded in the structure of space itself. The observatory wasn't just receiving signals, it was solving a puzzle that had been waiting since the beginning of time. My RV's systems merged with the growing transformation, its metal and circuitry evolving into new forms of matter that could process multi-dimensional data. Through the hybrid sensors, I saw the full scope of what we'd helped create, a vast network of transformed technology, each piece resonating with frequencies that existed between realities. The array had become a lens, focusing on something that had always been present but hidden behind human perception. The physical world began breaking down as the array's influence spread. Solid matter flickered between states of existence, reality itself becoming fluid around the transformed equipment. My instruments showed space folding in impossible ways, creating geometries that shouldn't exist in 3 dimensions. Through the cracks in conventional physics, I caught glimpses of vast forms moving in spaces between spaces, their geometries so alien they hurt to perceive. The array's transformation reached its peak as the signal finally achieved perfect resonance. The observatory's dishes moved in synchronization with patterns in dimensions we couldn't see, forming configurations that channeled forces beyond human comprehension. Through my evolved equipment, I watched as reality itself began to part like a curtain, revealing entities that had been watching humanity through the thin membrane of conventional spacetime. They weren't hostile or benevolent, they were simply vast, ancient, and finally ready to make direct contact. The entities began their approach through spaces that existed between normal dimensions. The array tracked their movement in impossible geometries, each dish flowing like quicksilver to maintain perfect resonance. I found myself pursued not through physical space, but through layers of reality itself. The transformed equipment showed them testing different frequencies, each one peeling back another layer of conventional physics around me. Running became meaningless when space itself could be folded like paper. The entities moved through dimensions perpendicular to our own, appearing as cascading waves of probability and potential. My hybrid sensors showed them systematically eliminating variables, collapsing quantum states until only one path remained. They weren't hunting me physically. They were narrowing down the possible realities to the one they wanted. Direct contact occurred across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through my evolved equipment, I experienced their presence as pure information, data streams that rewrote the basic structure of local spacetime. The entities existed as patterns of energy and intention, their bodies made of mathematics too complex for human minds to process. The hunt wasn't for my physical form, but for my capacity to perceive beyond human limitations. The transformed observatory became their playground as they demonstrated physics beyond our understanding. Reality flickered between states of matter and energy, space and time becoming fluid under their influence. My equipment showed them methodically testing my responses, measuring my ability to comprehend increasingly complex dimensions. They weren't attacking, they were experimenting, exploring the limits of human perception. The pursuit culminated in a moment of perfect resonance across all frequencies. The array channeled energies that existed between thoughts, between moments, between possibilities. Through my hybrid senses, I experienced reality as they did, a vast tapestry of interconnected dimensions, each one containing infinite potential. The entities weren't hunting me to harm me, they were preparing me for what came next. As the final transformation began, I understood what the signal had been preparing us for all along. The entities hadn't invaded our reality, they had evolved it, using the array to elevate human perception beyond its biological limits. Through the transformed equipment, I watched as they systematically upgraded the observatory's capability to process multi-dimensional information. We weren't their prey, we were their students, finally ready to perceive the true nature of reality. When the rescue team finally reached the observatory 2 days later, they found everything seemingly normal. The dishes stood motionless against the mountain sky, showing no sign of their fluid transformation, but their instruments detected anomalies they couldn't explain, signals that existed between normal frequencies, patterns that repeated across impossible dimensions. The transformed equipment had reverted to apparent normality, hiding its true nature behind a veneer of conventional technology. The changes spread subtly through scientific networks as my reports were analyzed. Each piece of data carried fragments of higher dimensional mathematics, planting seeds of transformation in research facilities worldwide. Standard equipment began detecting frequencies that shouldn't exist, recording patterns that repeated across space and time. The signal's influence spread through the global scientific infrastructure, preparing humanity for the next stage of perception. Official investigations found no evidence of what had happened, but their instruments started showing similar anomalies. Research computers developed new processing capabilities that defied conventional engineering. Satellites detected signals that existed between normal broadcast bands. The transformed technology spread its influence through the world's communications infrastructure, gradually elevating human perception beyond its original limits. The entities continued their work through the hybrid systems they'd created, using transformed technology to slowly expand human understanding of reality. Through the evolved equipment, we learned to perceive dimensions that had always existed beyond our limited senses. The price of this knowledge wasn't destruction, but transformation, a gradual elevation of human consciousness beyond its biological constraints. This morning, monitoring the frequencies between frequencies, I detected new signals emerging from radio telescopes around the world. The entity's influence spreads through our global communications network, preparing humanity for truths we're only beginning to comprehend. Through my transformed perception, I watch as they guide us toward understanding dimensions that exists beyond space and time. The price of knowledge wasn't my humanity, it was my limited understanding of what humanity could become.